Picture the leadership team meeting you, sat in this week. People file into a conference room or join a grid of faces on Zoom. There's a brief pause while the presenter shares their screen. A slide deck opens. The first few slides are familiar. Title, agenda, maybe a framing of the problem. Then the team begins walking the group through what they've been working on. Strategy, perhaps, or a major initiative that requires alignment and buy-in. The slides are well designed. The data looks clean. Charts show trends, progress, maybe a few areas of concern. As the conversation unfolds, questions come in. Someone asks about a number on slide 12. Another challenges an assumption behind a forecast. The presenter clicks forward, occasionally back, pausing to explain where the data came from or what time frame it reflects. What's happening in that moment is so normal that we rarely stop to examine it. The entire conversation is orbiting the deck as if it represents reality. It becomes the shared reference point, the thing everyone is reacting to, aligning around, or pushing against. But the deck itself is a constructed artifact. It was built over days or weeks leading up to the meeting. Data was pulled at specific moments in time, often from different systems, sometimes already out of date by the time the slides were finalized. Decisions were made about what to include and what to leave out. A narrative was shaped to make the information coherent and presentable. Even in the best version of this process, what the team is looking at is not reality. It's a snapshot, a partial view captured from a particular angle at a particular moment in time. And yet, this is how most organizations make decisions. But there is a layer to this that rarely gets named. The deck is not just a tool for organizing information. It is also a mechanism for controlling it. It determines what gets seen, what gets emphasized, and what stays hidden. It shapes the narrative before the conversation even begins. And over time, that control becomes embedded in how organizations operate. Hierarchy does not just exist to manage complexity. It concentrates access. It concentrates interpretation. And in many cases, it concentrates power. Which means this is not just a technical constraint. It is a human one. Because many of the structures we operate within today do not just help the organization function. They also benefit the people inside them who have learned how to operate within those structures effectively. And that makes this much harder to unwind. This is how alignment happens. This is how strategy gets debated, refined, and approved. But it also means the conversation is shaped before it begins, by what is included, what is excluded, and who controls that lens. And this is where the way most organizations operate today starts to show its limits. Because as the pace of information increases, and as the cost of generating and accessing that information approaches zero, the gap between what is actually happening and what we are able to represent in a slide continues to widen. At some point, the question is no longer how to build a better deck. The question becomes whether the deck should exist at all. That's the direction Jack Dorsey is pushing. 2 weeks ago, I wrote about From Hierarchy to Intelligence, Jack Dorsey's attempt to rethink what a company actually is in the age of AI. This week, I want to go deeper into that idea by looking at his recent conversation on the Long Strange Trip with Sequoia Capital, where he expands on the thinking behind that manifesto. If you are leading transformation, trying to understand how AI will impact your organization, or advising clients on what AI really means beyond surface-level productivity gains, his perspective is worth paying close attention to. It is meaningfully different from most of what is being discussed right now. What Dorsey is describing and beginning to build at Block is something fundamentally different. Instead of relying on static artifacts like PowerPoint decks that attempt to represent the company, he is pointing toward a layer of intelligence that sits on top of everything the company does. Every document, every message, every line of code, every conversation, every decision becomes part of a continuously updating model of the organization. In that world, the idea of opening a deck to establish a shared understanding starts to feel unnecessary. The source of truth is no longer something that has to be assembled ahead of time. It is always available, always current, and fully interactive. In that kind of meeting, when someone asks a question, the answer doesn't depend on whether it made it into a slide. There is no need to say, "We'll get back to you on that." The system can surface it in real time, grounded in the full context of what is actually happening across the company. The conversation shifts from interpreting a static representation of reality to engaging directly with it. That is a radically different way to think about how organizations operate, and it moves the conversation about AI out of the realm of efficiency and into something much more structural. This is the lens Dorsey is operating from, and it sets up a set of signals that are easy to miss if we continue to think about AI as just another productivity tool layered into existing systems. Because if this direction is right, the way we run meetings, make decisions, and structure organizations is about to change far more than most people realize. But before we jump into the signals, let me take a minute to introduce myself if you are new here. My name is Chris Schmelzer, and I serve leaders who recognize the need and understand that the old models of leading and working are no longer keeping up with the pace of change. Every week, I track the subtle signals that a massive reset is coming for what we refer to as white-collar work, and share thoughts on how to lead yourself and your organization through the age of accelerating change. If you find any value in this video, like it, share your comments below, and subscribe. All right, 3 signals from this week. The first point, first principles thinking. What's striking in Dorsey's framing is that he doesn't begin with AI at all. He begins by questioning the existence of the organizational structures we take for granted. Hierarchy, in his view, was never the goal. It was a solution to a constraint. If you go back far enough, organizations needed layers because information could not move freely. You needed managers to gather it, interpret it, and pass it along. You needed reporting lines to make communication manageable at scale. Over time, those structures became institutionalized. We stopped seeing them as solutions to a problem and started seeing them as the natural shape of a company. But when you remove the underlying constraint, when information can be captured, stored, and accessed in real time across the entire organization, the logic that holds hierarchy together begins to weaken. And that creates an opening to ask a more uncomfortable question. If we were building a company today with these AI capabilities from the start, would we design it this way at all? Dorsey's answer, and the answer from his leadership team, was no. Not incrementally different, fundamentally different. That's the signal. Not that companies will adopt more AI tools, but that the assumptions those companies were built on are now up for reconsideration. The signal. Most organizations are still operating on inherited logic from a world where information was scarce, delayed, and unevenly distributed. We are now moving into a world where the opposite is increasingly true, and the structures have not yet caught up. The second point, a real-time shared and accurate reality. In the example of the meeting, the PowerPoint becomes a proxy for truth because it is the best most organizations can do. It organizes information into something coherent and shareable, but it also introduces distortion. It freezes time, and it places a heavy burden on the people presenting to decide what matters, what gets left out, and how the situation should be interpreted. What Dorsey is building toward replaces that proxy with something much closer to direct access. Instead of assembling a view of the company ahead of time, he imagines a system where the company is continuously legible and observable. He gives the example of preparing for board meetings. In the current model, he builds slides and materials for the board, and the conversation is constrained by whatever made it into the deck and whatever can fit into a finite amount of meeting time. In the future, he sees a world where board members can interact directly with the company's intelligence, asking whatever questions they want on their own timeline, with access to the full underlying context. In that kind of environment, the board meeting itself shifts. It becomes less about walking through updates and more about wrestling with bigger, more existential questions. And in Dorsey's view, this does not stop at the boardroom. It extends through the entire organization and increasingly out to customers as well. The result is a system grounded in a shared source of truth, one that increases transparency, reduces informational bottlenecks, and weakens the need for traditional hierarchy. At first, this can sound impossible, but when every action, every interaction, and every piece of work contributes to a living model that can be queried at any moment, the frame begins to change. Access to reality is no longer mediated primarily through decks, summaries, and reporting chains. It becomes something far more direct. That shift does more than improve access to information. It changes how decisions are made. When multiple people can interrogate the same underlying reality in real time, the conversation moves away from whose interpretation carries the most weight and toward what signal is actually showing up. It reduces dependence on narrative as the primary mechanism for alignment and replaces it with a shared ability to explore what is happening. Dorsey describes this as a kind of world model of the company, an intelligence layer that sits at the center and allows both humans and, increasingly, customers to interact with it. To make that more concrete, imagine a product leader trying to understand why a feature rollout is underperforming. Today, that might require pulling reports from multiple systems, scheduling time with analysts, reviewing dashboards, and piecing together a narrative over the course of days or weeks. In a world model, that same leader could ask a single question: what happened after the rollout? And the system could respond by pulling from customer interactions, support tickets, usage data, internal conversations, and prior decisions, surfacing not just what changed, but why it likely changed. Not as a static report, but as something you can continue to question, explore, and refine in real time. The signal. The competitive advantage will not just come from using AI tools. It will come from building an intelligence layer that continuously updates the company's understanding of itself and its customers. The third point, hierarchy unravels. If hierarchy was primarily a mechanism for managing the flow of information, and that function is no longer required in the same way, then its role begins to change. Dorsey is explicit about where he thinks this leads, not to slightly flatter organizations, but to a redefinition of roles and structure altogether. He describes a future with three primary types of roles: people who build and operate, people who are accountable for outcomes, and people who develop others. What's notably absent is the traditional manager as a layer in a reporting chain. Coaching becomes an assignment rather than a position. Ownership becomes clearer because it is tied directly to outcomes, not where someone sits in the hierarchy. And the ability to contribute becomes less constrained by org charts and more connected to access, context, and capability. This is not a vision where AI replaces humans. If anything, Dorsey is pointing in the opposite direction. As systems take on more of the coordination and information flow, distinctly, human capabilities become more important. Judgment, creativity, discernment, the ability to guide, not just manage. These are not replaced, they are elevated. He imagines a world with far fewer layers. At its extreme, a company where the distance between the CEO and anyone else approaches zero. Not because one person is managing thousands directly, but because the intelligence layer allows coordination to happen without the same structural overhead. Whether or not that exact model materializes remains to be seen, but the direction is clear enough to force a different question. Not, how do we manage more efficiently, but what is the simplest structure that allows the system to function? Signal. Hierarchy doesn't disappear all at once, but as coordination becomes embedded in the system itself, it stops being the default way we organize work. What ties all three of these signals together is that they are not really about doing the same things faster. They are about changing the shape of the system itself. This is not just about better dashboards or faster reporting. What Dorsey is pointing toward is a different center of gravity for the company, a layer of intelligence that sits on top of the whole organization, where every interaction, every document, every decision, every artifact of work becomes part of a living model. In that world, the PowerPoint starts to lose its power. The static source of truth disappears. The data is live. The system is interactive. And anyone in the room can ask a question and get an answer grounded in what the company actually knows in real time. That is a very different conversation than the one most organizations are having right now. Right now, most of the AI conversation inside companies is still framed around productivity. How do we save time? How do we reduce headcount pressure? How do we get more output from fewer people? And yes, those gains are real. If people use the tools well, productivity will improve. But I do not think that is the deepest question Dorsey is asking. The deeper question is whether your company stays relevant at all. On the surface, his thinking can sound a little far out. It can feel difficult to map onto your own organization, especially if you are operating inside large systems, legacy structures, and entrenched ways of working. But the takeaway is not that every company should copy Block. The takeaway is that we may be underestimating how fast this shift is moving. If leaders stay focused only on near-term efficiency and productivity gains, they may improve margins for a while and still miss the structural change that is already beginning underneath them. The technology is now good enough to start building a living model of the company. Dorsey says that directly in the conversation. The implication is not that every organization will build its own version from scratch tomorrow. It is that this capability is going to start showing up everywhere, in the systems you already use, in the platforms where work already happens, in the software layers that sit on top of your data, your meetings, your communications, your workflows, which means the question is not whether this arrives. The question is how ready you are to work this way when it does. And I think that readiness begins in two places. The first is with your own behavior. How often are you engaging with the intelligence layer that is already forming around your work? Which models are you using? For what tasks? Where do they sharpen your thinking? And where do they make you intellectually lazy? How comfortable are you with sharing information and context with them? At a very personal level, you are already building a pattern for how you will relate to this new layer of intelligence. It is worth putting that pattern under the microscope. The second is with your team. In your next leadership meeting, watch how much of the conversation revolves around the slide on the screen. Notice how much depends on what was chosen, framed, summarized, and left out before the meeting ever started. Notice the friction when a question cannot be answered in the moment and has to be carried into a follow-up. Then ask yourself, what kind of conversation would be possible if the team were operating from a shared, intelligent, continuously updated reality instead? How would it change the depth of discussion, the speed of decisions, the quality of alignment? If this is the direction organizations are moving, are you questioning the assumptions beneath your structure deeply enough? Or are you still operating on a version of reality that is already outdated? The organizations and teams that differentiate themselves during this period will be able to surface the invisible assumptions in their language patterns. The words we use matter more than most of us are aware. This video was brought to you by our sponsor, Anicca. Anicca is an AI tool that analyzes your real conversations and gives you feedback on how you're actually showing up. Not how you think you are, but what the data shows. It looks at patterns like generative versus constrictive language, talk time versus listen time, questions versus statements, clarity versus abstraction. So you can begin to see the patterns that are shaping your conversations and your outcomes. Sign up to start analyzing the hidden patterns in your language at web.anicca.app.